She had not said a single word in 3 years. Not to the team of specialists her father flew in from Tokyo. Not to the child psychologist who charged $10,000 a session. Not to the priests, the healers, the whisper therapists, or the grief counselors who lined up outside the doors of the most feared penthouse in all of Seoul. Not even to him, her own father, the man whose name alone made grown men lower their eyes and cross the street. 3 years of silence. And then one Tuesday evening, in the private dining room of a restaurant that didn't exist on any public map, a black waitress walked in carrying a tray of food she hadn't ordered and started to move. Not dramatically, not loudly, just moved, like she had done it 1,000 times before in a place only she could see. And the little girl, the silent, hollow-eyed, 8-year-old daughter of the most dangerous man in South Korea, lifted her head for the first time in months. What she said next would bring her father to his knees. But what she revealed, that would shake the walls of everything he had built. And here is what no one knew yet. The silence was never about losing her voice. It was about something she had seen, something she was never supposed to see, something that lived inside the walls of the very home her father believed was protecting her. Stay right there, because this story is about to go places you are not expecting. Before you go any further, if this is your first time here, subscribe right now, hit the like button, and turn on your notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. We tell the kind of stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Now let's get into it, because the truth this little girl had been carrying, it was heavier than anything her father had ever lifted. His name was Jang Mi-ho, 41 years old, 6 feet of controlled silence wrapped in a tailored black coat. The kind of man who never raised his voice because he had never needed to. The kind of man whose stillness in a room was more terrifying than another man screaming. He had built his empire from the ground up, starting in the back alleys of Mapo-gu, earning his place not through inheritance, but through sheer, brutal precision. By the time he was 30, 3 rival organizations had folded under the quiet weight of his name. By 35, he had legitimate businesses spread across Seoul, Busan, and Incheon, restaurants, real estate, a private logistics company that moved things no customs officer ever inspected twice. He had everything a man like him was supposed to want. Everything except the one thing that mattered. His daughter's voice. Her name was Ji-yeon. And before the silence, she had been the loudest, brightest, most relentlessly curious child he had ever known. She would chase him down the hallway every morning demanding he explain things. Why the sky was blue, why his coat smelled like smoke, why the men who came to their house always spoke in such low voices. She laughed the way only children who have not yet learned fear can laugh, full-bellied, reckless, completely without shame. He had loved that laugh with a fierceness that embarrassed him. Then it stopped. One night, a Tuesday, exactly like this one, Ji-yeon went silent. Not gradually, not with warning, just stopped. Mi-ho had come home late, which was not unusual. He had found her sitting at the top of the stairs, fully dressed at midnight, staring at the front door with an expression that no child her age should ever wear. He had knelt in front of her. He had said her name. She had looked at him, right through him, and said nothing. She had said nothing since. The first doctor told him it was acute trauma response. The second used the word selective mutism and handed him a pamphlet. The third flew in from a clinic in Osaka and spent 6 sessions drawing pictures with Ji-yeon, trying to coax a sound, any sound, from behind those still, watchful eyes. Ji-yeon would sit through every session with the quiet patience of someone who had made a decision and was not going to be argued out of it. She ate. She slept. She moved through the penthouse like a small, careful ghost. She never spoke. Mi-ho did not know how to process helplessness. It was not a feeling he had ever permitted himself. In every other area of his life, there was an action to take, a lever to pull, a problem to dismantle piece by piece until it surrendered. But his daughter sat across the dinner table every evening and watched him with those enormous dark eyes, and he had no lever. He had nothing. He would sit there in his $10 million apartment with the city of Seoul glittering 40 floors below and feel, for the first time in his life, completely and utterly powerless. He hated it. He hated himself for hating it. His right-hand man, a sharp-faced man named Kwon who had been with him since the beginning, once suggested that maybe the child needed more time and less intervention. Mi-ho had stared at him for so long that Kwon had quietly excused himself from the room and did not raise the subject again. What no one said out loud, what everyone around Mi-ho was too careful to whisper, was that the silence had started the night of the incident. The night something had happened in that house that Mi-ho had spent 3 years trying to contain. The restaurant did not have a name on the outside. It did not need one. It sat on a quiet street in Hanam-dong, behind a dark wooden door with no handle visible from the street. You only got in if someone who mattered vouched for you. Inside, the lighting was low and warm. The tables were spaced far enough apart that conversation stayed private, and the staff had been trained to move like shadows, present when needed, invisible when not. Miho brought Jiyeon there sometimes on evenings when the penthouse felt too large and too quiet even for silence. The owner, an old associate, kept a private room in the back with soft lighting and no music, because music made Jiyeon flinch. The staff knew not to approach her directly. They knew not to raise their voices, not to drop things, not to laugh too suddenly. They knew the rules. What they did not know was that 3 weeks ago, the restaurant had hired someone new. Her name was Adiz. She was 26 years old, Nigerian by birth, Seoul by circumstance. She had arrived in South Korea 2 years earlier on a language scholarship that ran out before she did, and she had stayed because going back felt like admitting something she was not ready to admit yet. She was not tall, not loud, not the kind of person who filled a room with her presence the moment she walked in. She was the opposite of that. She had a way of moving through spaces like she understood that some rooms did not belong to her, and she was fine with that. She did not need to own every space she entered. She just needed to survive it. She had learned that early. Growing up in Enugu, in a house where silence was also a survival skill, where you learn to read the atmosphere before you read a room, Adiz had developed a particular sensitivity to the kind of quiet that was not peaceful, the kind that had weight to it, the kind that pressed down on a person from the inside. She knew the difference between a child who was shy and a child who was holding something too heavy for their chest. She had been that child once. She recognized the shape of it the way you recognize a scar on someone else's skin because you have the same one. She had been working the private dining room for 3 weeks without incident when Miho brought Jiyeon in on a cold Wednesday evening in November. Adiz had been briefed by the senior staff the same way all new staff were briefed. The man in room 4, do not make eye contact, do not speak unless spoken to, do not approach the child, do not make sudden movements, do not ask questions. She had nodded through all of it with the practiced calm of someone who had navigated far more complicated instructions in far less forgiving environments. She was not afraid of him. That surprised her a little. Even in the brief moment she had glimpsed him from across the restaurant, the stillness of him, the weight his presence carried, the way the other staff seemed to slightly shrink whenever his name was mentioned, she had felt something closer to curiosity than fear. She had grown up around men who used silence as a weapon. She knew what that looked like. She also knew it did not make them invincible. It just made them lonely in ways they could not explain. She carried the first course into room 4 without looking at either of them directly. She set the plates down with steady hands. She topped up the water glass. She was halfway to the door when she heard it, or rather, felt it. That particular quality of stillness that meant a child was watching her. She did not turn around immediately. She had learned that too, that children who were afraid did not always want to be seen seeing. She took one more step toward the door, then paused, and turned just enough so that her face was in profile. Jiyeon was watching her, not with fear, not with the flat vacancy that Miho had grown so desperate to crack, with something sharper than that, something that looked, from this angle, almost like recognition. Adiz held the eye contact for exactly 1 second, soft, unhurried, without demand, and then she left the room. She thought about that look for the rest of the evening. She could not explain why it stayed with her the way it did. She had seen quiet children before. She had worked enough hospitality shifts in enough private venues to understand that wealthy children often had a particular kind of withdrawal to them. Too much money, not enough touch. But this was different. This child was not bored or detached. She was listening to something no one else in the room could hear. She was inside a world that had closed its doors to everyone else, and she was not trying to get out. That was the part that unsettled Adiz. She was not trying to get out. The following Wednesday, they came back. Adiz was assigned to room 4 again because one of the other staff had called in sick, and she was the only one available. She accepted the assignment without comment, pulled her hair back, straightened her uniform, and carried the water tray to the private room with the same composed efficiency she always carried everything. Jiyeon was already seated when she entered. The child looked up the moment the door opened, not startled, not wary, just ready, like she had been waiting to see if it would be the same person as last time. When her eyes landed on Adiz, something in her small shoulders dropped a fraction. Not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. Miho did not look up from the document he was reviewing. He had a glass of whiskey untouched at his elbow and the particular tension in his jaw that Adiz was already beginning to recognize as his default expression. The look of a man who was mentally somewhere else entirely, somewhere darker, and was using the performance of normalcy as a way to stay tethered. Adiz poured the water, set the breadbasket down, adjusted the placement of the side plate by exactly 1 centimeter, not because it needed it, but because the action gave her an excuse to stay in the room for 2 extra seconds. In those 2 seconds, she hummed. It was not a conscious decision. It was something she did when she was thinking, a low, almost inaudible thread of melody from a song her mother used to sing in the kitchen in Enugu on mornings when the world felt manageable. She was not performing it. She was not directing it at anyone. It was simply the sound that lived in her chest when her hands were busy and her mind was elsewhere. She stopped the moment she realized she had done it. But it was too late. Jiyeon had gone completely still. Not the familiar stillness of withdrawal. This was different. This was the stillness of someone who had just heard something that did not belong in the world they had locked themselves inside. The child's eyes were wide, fixed on Adiz with an intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly thinner. Miho looked up from his document. He looked at his daughter, then at Adiz. His expression did not change. But something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker of something he immediately extinguished. He looked back down at his papers. "You can go," he said quietly. Adiz nodded and left. She was clearing a table in the main dining room 40 minutes later when she heard the sound coming from the private hallway. It stopped her completely. It was faint, so faint she thought at first she had imagined it. But she set the tray down and stood still and listened, and there it was again. A sound she had not expected. A sound that had not been heard in that building, or in the penthouse 4 kilometers north, or in any room Jiyeon had occupied in 3 full years. It was the ghost of a hum. Fragile, uncertain, like something that had forgotten its own shape and was trying to remember. For notes, repeated twice, then silence. Adiz stood in the hallway with her hand pressed flat against her sternum and felt something she could not name move through her chest. From inside the private room, she heard Miho's chair scrape back. Then silence. Then, very quietly, the sound of a grown man exhaling like he had been holding his breath for 3 years. The third Wednesday was when everything broke open. Miho had not planned to bring Jiyeon again so soon. Their visits to the restaurant were usually spaced 2 weeks apart, a routine built around Jiyeon's thresholds, the careful management of her environment, the exhausting calculus of keeping her world small enough to feel safe. But 4 days after the second visit, Jiyeon had done something she had not done in 3 years. She had walked to the front door of the penthouse, picked up her coat from the hook, and stood there holding it. She did not look at Miho. She did not speak. She just stood there holding the coat. He stared at her for a long moment, his chest doing something complicated and painful. Then he picked up his own coat. They left together without a word. The restaurant was quiet when they arrived. It was a Sunday this time. Unusual, unscheduled, and the staff were caught slightly off guard. Adiz was in the middle of a shift change brief when her supervisor appeared at the door with an expression that said the plan had changed. She was needed in room 4. She finished buttoning her cuff, picked up the water tray, and went. The moment she stepped inside, she understood that something was different tonight. Jiyeon was not seated at the table. She was standing near the far wall, her back to the room, her fingers touching the wallpaper in slow, deliberate strokes, the way a child touches something when they are trying to decide if it is real. Miho was standing near the window with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the specific look of a man who was holding himself together through sheer force of structure. "She does that sometimes," he said, without turning to look at Adiz. His voice was flat, but there was something cracked running underneath it. "I don't know what it means." Adiz set the tray down carefully. She looked at Jiyeon, at the way the child's shoulders were curved inward, protective, braced, at the deliberate precision of those small fingers against the wall. "She's grounding herself," Adiz said quietly. Miho turned to look at her. His expression was not warm. "You're a waitress." "Yes," Adiz said simply. She did not flinch. "But I've done that too." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. And then, from across the room, Jiyeon slowly turned around. She was looking directly at Adiz. Not through her. Not past her. Directly at her, with those enormous, still, fathomless eyes that had been looking at the world for 3 years without responding to any of it. And in them, for the first time, there was something unmistakable. Something that made Adiz's breath catch so quietly that only she noticed. The child was asking her something. Not with words. Not with gesture. With the specific, desperate, wordless language of someone who had been trying to communicate through locked glass for so long that they had almost stopped believing anyone could hear them. Adiz heard her. She set the water jug down on the table without breaking eye contact. She straightened up slowly. And then, with no announcement, no explanation, no performance, she began to move. It was not dancing. Not exactly. It was the way her body moved when she was at her most honest, a slow, grounded sway, feet barely leaving the floor, arms loose at her sides, weight shifting from one foot to the other in a rhythm so gentle it felt less like movement and more like breathing made visible. The same melody she had hummed 2 weeks ago rose again in her throat, quiet as candlelight, and she let it come this time. She did not stop it. The song was called something in Igbo that translated roughly to "The water is still, you are safe." Her mother had sung it to her in the years when home was not a safe word, when silence in their house meant something was coming, and Adiz had learned to make herself small in corners, grounding her palms flat against the wall, just the way Jiyeon was doing now. She had never sung it for anyone else. She sang it now without deciding to. Behind her, she heard Miho move. "What are you doing?" It was not a question. It had the clipped, dangerous edge of a man whose control over a situation was slipping and who had not given anyone permission for that. Adiz did not stop. I said stop. His voice dropped lower, which she had already learned meant it was more serious, not less. Stop this. Now. She heard him take a step forward. Heard the door open. Kwon, outside, reading the shift in his employer's tone the way only a man who had worked beside him for 15 years could. The room contracted. The atmosphere pulled tight, like a wire. And still Adiz moved. Soft. Slow. Unhurried. Like none of the tension in the room was louder than the rhythm in her chest. Because she could see what Miho could not see from where he was standing. Jiyeon had taken one step away from the wall. Just one. But it was one step that had not happened in 3 years. The child's fingers had left the wallpaper. Her arms were hanging at her sides, open, unguarded, in a posture Miho had not seen since the night everything changed. Her eyes were locked on Adiz's moving body like a person watching a fire after years in the cold, desperate, disbelieving, terrified of hoping. Sir. Adiz's voice was steady and low, barely above the melody. Please. Just wait. You do not tell me to wait in my own. She's moving. Kwon's voice, from the doorway. Flat. Stunned. Boss. The child is moving. The room went absolutely still. Miho turned. Jiyeon had taken a second step. Her head was slightly tilted, following the rhythm with her body the way a child follows music before they know the word for music. Her lips were parted. Her eyes were wet. And she was trembling. Not with fear, with the particular full-body trembling of someone who has been holding an unbearable weight alone for so long that the first moment of relief feels indistinguishable from collapse. Adiz slowed the sway, gentled the song, brought it down even lower, softer, a whisper of sound, barely a vibration. She held her hand out. Not grabbing, not reaching, just open. An offering. Take it if you want it. Leave it if you need to. Jiyeon stared at the open hand for a very long time. Then she crossed the room. It took 11 steps. Adiz counted them without meaning to. 11 small, deliberate, earth-shaking steps across a restaurant floor in Hanamdong, while the most feared man in Seoul stood frozen by the window and forgot, for the first time in 41 years, what it felt like to be afraid of nothing. Jiyeon's hand found Adiz's. Small fingers. Cold. Gripping with a fierceness that had nowhere else to go. Adiz closed her hand around them and kept swaying. Kept humming. Did not make a sound of triumph or relief or surprise, because this moment was not about any of those things. It was just two people, one small, one not, standing in the wreckage of a silence that had finally found a crack in the wall. And then Jiyeon spoke. It came out broken and hoarse and barely recognizable as language. 3 years of disuse had worn the edges off her voice until it sounded like something dragged up from very deep water. But it was words. Real, unmistakable words. Don't let them see me. For words. Whispered into the space between her and Adiz with the urgency of a secret that had been eating her alive. Adiz went very still. Not from shock. From recognition. From the specific, cold, clarifying recognition of someone who has just heard a sentence and understood instantly that it contains more history than it appears to. Don't let who see you, baby, she whispered back. Jiyeon's grip tightened. The men with the white envelopes. Her voice cracked on the last word. They saw me. On the stairs. And one of them looked at me and told the other one, and they didn't know I was still there. She stopped. Swallowed. I heard what they said. Behind them, the sound of Miho's glass hitting the table. Not breaking. Just landing. Hard. Jiyeon, his voice came out wrong. Too exposed. Too much of him suddenly visible in a single syllable. Jiyeon, what did you hear? The child turned her head slowly toward her father. And in her eyes was the answer to every question the past 3 years had generated. Every sleepless night. Every failed therapy session. Every expensive specialist. Every desperate prayer offered by a man who did not believe in prayer, but had run out of other options. It was not grief in those eyes. It was knowledge. She had not stopped speaking because she was broken. She had stopped speaking because she knew something. And somewhere in the wordless logic of an 8-year-old survival instinct, she had understood that knowing something dangerous and saying it out loud were two very different risks. She had chosen silence as armor. She had been wearing it for 3 years. And she had just taken it off. If you are still watching and you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. Hit that button. This is the kind of storytelling that deserves your support, and there is so much more where this came from. Like this video if this story is hitting different. You already know it is. The next 2 hours inside that private room were the most honest hours of Jang Miho's life. He sat on the floor, not in the chair, not behind the distance of a table, on the actual floor, with his back against the wall and his daughter 3 feet away still holding Adiz's hand, and he listened. Really listened. The way he had not listened to anything in years, because listening required a stillness that was different from the controlled stillness he had cultivated as a weapon. This listening required him to be open, undefended, fully present in a room where the walls were closing in and the thing being revealed was his own reflection. Ji-yeon told them what she had heard on the stairs that night. She told them slowly, haltingly, in the fractured voice of someone relearning how sound worked. She told them about the two men in the hallway, about the white envelopes she had watched them exchange, about the words she had not understood then, but had turned over in her silence every single day until their meaning had worn itself clear. Words about a debt, about leverage, about what would happen if Miho did not comply, about the name of the person they were working for, a name that Miho recognized, a name that told him something he had spent 3 years refusing to suspect. The betrayal had not come from outside his organization. It had come from inside his house, from someone he trusted with his schedule, his security, his daughter's routine, someone whose presence on that staircase that night had been no accident. Miho did not move while she spoke. He barely breathed. When she finished, the silence that followed was entirely different from the silence of the past 3 years. This one had air in it. This one had room. He looked at his daughter for a long time, at her small hands still wrapped around Adi's, at the way she was watching him, not with fear, not anymore, with something harder than fear and softer at the same time, with the particular expression of a child who loves someone and is terrified that the love is misplaced. All this power, he said finally. His voice was barely above a whisper. All of it. And I couldn't protect you from what was already inside the walls. Ji-yeon looked at him. I wasn't afraid of you, Appa, she said. Her voice broke clean on the last word. I was afraid for you. Something in Miho's face came apart. Not dramatically, not loudly. The way stone comes apart when water has been working through it for years, suddenly, quietly, irreversibly. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and looked at the ceiling, and the city 40 floors below continued its indifferent glittering, and none of it mattered at all. Adiz looked away. This moment was not hers to witness any more than it had to be. She began to gently ease her hand from Ji-yeon's, but Ji-yeon held on. Don't go, the child said. Adiz stilled. Can you stay? Just a little longer. She looked at Miho. He had collected himself with the practiced speed of a man who had spent decades keeping his interior life invisible. But his eyes, when they met hers, were different from every other time they had connected across this room. They were not guarded. They were not cold. They were just present, human, asking the same question his daughter had asked, just without words. A little longer, Adiz said quietly. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. Ji-yeon began speaking in fragments at first, single sentences, carefully placed, like a person testing the structural integrity of a bridge before committing their full weight. Then longer. Then, startlingly, in laughter, the first time it happened, Miho had stopped walking in the middle of the hallway and stood there with one hand braced against the wall, just listening, as though afraid that moving would end it. He had reorganized 2 things in his life during those weeks. The first was internal, swift, precise, and permanent. The man with the white envelopes had been dealt with in the manner that Miho's world demanded, and he did not discuss it further. The second reorganization was quieter and more unfamiliar and more difficult than anything he had done in 20 years of operating in darkness. He began to come home earlier. Not just physically earlier. Present in the way that mattered, at the dinner table without a document in his hand, on the floor of the living room while Ji-yeon showed him things on her tablet, in the doorway of her room in the evenings instead of moving past it like a man with somewhere more important to be. He did not announce this change or make a speech about it. He simply began to show up differently, and Ji-yeon noticed, and the noticing made her braver, and the braver she became the more he understood what he had been losing all along. He also began, quietly and with no explanation to anyone, returning to the restaurant on Thursday evenings. Not always with Ji-yeon. Sometimes alone. He told himself it was because he preferred the private room. Because the food was good. Because the atmosphere suited him. He told himself this for 2 Thursdays before he stopped pretending and admitted, to himself only, that he was returning because of a 26-year-old woman from Enugu, who moved like she had made peace with the world and had no interest in impressing him, and was the only person in recent memory who had told him to wait and been right. On the 3rd Thursday, he arrived to find her clearing glasses from a side table near the entrance. She looked up when the door opened and her expression moved through 3 things in quick succession. Surprise, composure, something she locked away before it became readable. Mr. Jang. Professional. Neutral. Ji-yeon asked me to thank you, he said. She said you'd know what for. Adiz's expression softened at the child's name. How is she? Loud, he said. And the single word carried so much in it. Relief, wonder, gratitude. 3 years of accumulated grief finally finding somewhere to rest. That Adiz felt the weight of it land in her own chest. Good, she said. Loud is good. He nodded. Turned to go. Stopped with his hand on the door frame. I didn't come just to deliver the message, he said, without turning around. His voice was lower now. Less rehearsed. I came because, he stopped. Started again. I came as her father. Not as anything else. Not as who I am out there. A pause. Just as her father. The restaurant was quiet around them. Adiz set the glass down on the tray. I know, she said simply. He turned then. And for the first time since she had met him, Jang Mi-ho looked uncertain. Not dangerous uncertain. Not controlled uncertain. Just genuinely, humanly unsure of what came next, and making no attempt to hide it. Can I see you again? He said it directly. No pretense. No performance. Not for her. For me. Adiz looked at him for a long moment. Outside, Seoul continued its noise. The traffic, the neon, the endless relentless forward motion of a city that did not stop for anyone. Inside, there was just the two of them. A man standing in a doorway learning what it felt like to ask instead of take. A woman deciding whether the answer her heart was already moving toward was one she was ready to say out loud. She picked up her tray. She walked past him toward the kitchen. And at the door, she paused. She did not turn around. But the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. Just enough. Thursday, she said. Same time. And she walked through. If this story moved you, and something tells me it did, then subscribe right now if you haven't already. Turn on your notification bell so you catch every single story we drop. Hit the like button because it means everything to this channel. And leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. What moment hit you the hardest? Was it when Jiyeon finally spoke? When Mi-ho sat on the floor? When Adiz said Thursday? Share this video with someone you love. Someone who needs to be reminded that healing does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it hums. Sometimes it holds your hand. Sometimes it crosses a room in 11 steps and changes everything. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you in the next one.